who it says in the early part of chapter 15 was a good friend of Mike's. They spent a lot of time together doing a number of different things, not worldly things, because Mike makes the comment in this chapter that Larry lived a very clean life. He didn't even drink coffee and things like that. So he was somebody who took very good care of himself in an aspect of being clean from some things of this world. Not just worldly, sinful things, but other things as well. And so he makes those comments about Larry, but he says Larry had been hiding from him, basically, had not let him know that Larry had been studying with Randall too. And so now Larry comes in saying, I was baptized today. And a discussion takes place. Now it says that Mike noted that it was 9:12 in the evening when Larry came over and they first began discussing something. And he says at midnight they were still discussing some things, still looking at some things. This is what I'm asking about from that consideration. What's different about Larry than Randall? Okay, so far, Randall's discussions have been a co-worker, somebody who's becoming more and more friendly all the time. They have a friendship that's growing now. Why do Michael and Randall have a friendship that's growing? Because Randall approached him and kept talking to him, and they've had a lot of back and forth discussion and study together. And so relationship's growing. He has learned to trust Randall so that when Randall says something, he automatically knows he's going to have Bible for that. He's learning to trust Randall. They're building a relationship. Well, he and Larry have already had a relationship that has not been a relationship in Christ. It has not been this same type of relationship of Bible study and focus and things looking at godly issues or spiritual issues. Their friendship has been in other realms. But now Larry comes into his house and immediately starts talking to him about being baptized today and about spiritual matters. And Mike starts questioning Randall not Randall, I just said Randall, didn't I? He starts questioning Larry about some things, and they have a discussion that lasts for hours. Do you know there's not been one time so far that Mike and Randall have done this? What's the difference in Larry's discussion with Mike and the way Randall has been dealing with Mike? There's already a relationship built on many other things. They've worked together. They've had so much connection together. There's already relationship, but there's another big difference too.
They're coming to the truth about the same time.
Larry is aware that Mike has been talking to Randall because Mike has been talking to Larry. Sometimes when Mike would bring a scripture, or Randall rather would bring a scripture to Mike, Mike would end up talking to Larry about it. And you remember at one point when Randall gave him the little piece of paper with a scripture on it, he didn't have a Bible. Whose Bible did they use to look that up? Do you remember what it said about Larry at that point? He had just started carrying a Bible with him. I wonder why. It didn't tell us that back then. It just said he had just started carrying a Bible in his bag or briefcase. And so they used Larry's Bible to look it up. Well, now we know why Larry had started carrying a Bible with him. Because he'd been studying with Randall without telling Mike. So he was already working to look up scriptures and read these things and see what the Bible said about it. Randall already had Larry digging in the Bible without Mike even knowing it. Well, Larry was watching Mike go through this and seeing him ask the same kind of questions and deal with the same things. So he's already been down this path, and he knows that his friend Mike is now coming down this same path. So when he obeys the gospel, it seems like he's exuberant and cannot wait to get over to Mike's house to tell him, look what I did today. I obeyed the gospel. I was baptized today. And so they start having a discussion, and it says it started shortly after 9 o'clock, and at midnight, they were still talking. There's another reason why Randall had never done this, and not just because they didn't already have a previous relationship, but Randall knew from the time he met Mike and had the first little bits of discussion with him that Mike did not have any background or knowledge of the truth the way that God gave it. So what did Randall do with Mike? He led him along a little piece at a time, bringing him along as he was able, much like Jesus did, as they were able to bear it, as they were able to handle it. What happens if you take somebody who is just now, for the first time, having their eyes open to the truth, and you sit down with them for 3 hours and bombard them with truth? You lose them very quickly. Why do you lose them? Let's say that it's backed up about an hour or two here tonight and it's supper time. And we all head down to a buffet. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet. And we sit down at a table and they start bringing trays of food to the table. And by the time they get done bringing trays of food, every one of us has a portion of food in front of us that's enough for 10 people. What are you going to do with it? I don't think any of us could sit down and eat 10 pounds of food at one time. It'd probably kill us if we did. So what would you do with that food? No, think it through for a minute. At that moment, I'm not talking about what you take with you. Right now, what would you do with all of that food? Okay, well, that's reasonable. Take a little bit of everything if you like it all. But we would all have a tendency to look through it and see what we would like the best. I know I can't eat all of it. So my tendency would be to look at it and see what I think I'm going to like better than the others. You know, I mean, if there's a steak and then there's asparagus, just be honest. I know what the priority is going to be. There you go. There you go. One washes down the other. That's all right. That's all right. I like asparagus. I'm not against asparagus. Elijah don't care for it, but I like it pretty well.
It's better when it's covered in meat.
Absolutely. Yeah. Au jus makes everything better, doesn't it? Okay, so we would prioritize is what we do. Even though we wouldn't really think about it that way, we might not think this is such a big deal. It's just a big pile of food. But what we would do is prioritize. We'd start looking at what we want first, and we'd take portions of what we want and need, and we'd eat that, and then we'd have to leave the rest. You sit down with somebody who's for the first time opening up to the truth, and you give them 3 or 4 or 5 hours of Bible study, and that's exactly what they're going to do up here. The things that really hit them, that may really jump out at them, those few things, maybe a handful of things if you're lucky. Most of the time when you're dealing with new information, if you give more than 2 or 3 pieces of information, the rest of it is like water off a duck's back. Not that they don't appreciate it or don't like it or don't want it, they just can't handle that much all at once. Because you're dealing, again, like we talked about, with intellect, you're dealing with emotion, you're dealing with someone's spirituality, you're dealing with a whole lot. So when you give a piece or 2 of information like Randall did, and then let them have it, let it simmer, let it soak in, let them contemplate, let them debate it in their own mind, let them tear it apart and put it back together and work with it. By the time you get done with all that, guess what happened with that little bit of information? Now it is yours. You'll keep it forever. It will actually become a building block of faith. But if you give them 50 pieces of information all in one sitting, when they've never heard any of this before, it's very likely that none of it will become a building block of faith because none of it really sticks. New information has to be mulled over. It has to be considered, pondered. You have to think on it and work with it so that you ingest the information and not just in one ear and out the other. How many times have you heard something that you know is a really crucial piece of information, but it was with such an onslaught of information that later on you're trying to remember what it was and you just can't really put the idea back together? When if you'd heard that one thing, and only that one thing, you would have been able to go home and think about it and write it down and really work with it. and it might actually benefit you in some way. Larry's not doing something bad here. I don't want us to get that idea. Larry's doing something different than what Randall was doing. Larry has come through this process of learning, no doubt like Mike did, a little bit at a time. And that's obvious because what happens for over 3 hours? They argue, they discuss, they debate, and what's Larry doing the whole time? He's taking him to the Bible. He's doing what Randall did to him. He's going to the Bible. You take somebody and you give them all that information in one sitting, and then they go talk to somebody the next day. Do you know where they're going to be able to turn in the Bible and find any of that? Likely nowhere. Because it was just too much to process and hold on to. We need to be considerate and thoughtful about how we approach someone and how we deal with them, even once we get a discussion going, in how much we feed them at one time. There are a number of passages that talk about learning the truth in the same type analogy there as eating, as feeding. Those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. When we see someone who's ready for it, they need the feeding. But they don't need 6 days' food all at once. They need that one meal. They need that one sitting. Yes, sir.
Desire the sincere milk of the word.
That you may grow thereby. Yes.
Feeding the baby.
That's exactly right. And he was even talking there about people who were in the faith, but they were babes in Christ. They were young. They need to be brought along more carefully and slowly so they can use what they're given. In Hebrews chapter 5, he turns around and gives a rebuke to these brethren who should have, by reason of use, by reason of exercise, should have moved on and matured, should have developed, but they had not. Why had they not matured and developed to where they could handle strong meat and still needed the milk? Because they weren't feeding regularly. All these pictures about feeding, and the picture that he's giving here of taking in, using, and growing with the Word of God, these are important. The reason Mike is able to have a 3-hour discussion with Larry at this point, and there be some good that comes out of it, is because Mike has been brought along now for several months with a little bit at a time. He's been working at it. He's been feeding on it. He's been taking this in. He's been fighting it, arguing about it, debating, asking somebody else to help him. He admits by the end of this chapter, I'm stubborn. And sometimes you have to do differently when you're dealing with a stubborn person. He says, I'm stubborn. I was still fighting and looking for a way to hold on to my past, to my spiritual background, to my Baptist beliefs. And just like with Larry, or with Randall, now Larry is coming to him saying, I've been seeing this and studying this and looking at this, and every time they have a question, Larry takes him right to the Bible and says, here's what it says, here's what it is, here's what you need to know. We need to think about this, though, when we're first dealing with someone. They can't handle 3 hours of Bible. You think about it. How many of us can handle 3 solid hours of Bible? And by handle it, I don't mean that we would disagree or break down. How many of us can listen to 3 hours of Bible class, of preaching, and take it all in and take it home with us and actually benefit from it? I've known of, I didn't know them. I've heard some of the sermons of Foy Wallace and Guy and Woods and some of these men from an earlier generation who sometimes would come in during a gospel meeting or something and preach a sermon that would be 2.5 hours long. 2.5 hours. And people loved them, loved hearing them, loved to go and would travel sometimes for several hours to get where they were holding a meeting in order to listen to them. Why? Today, you take some of the well-loved preachers that people adore and really appreciate them, and I don't mean in some wrong way. I just mean they really admire them and look up to them and appreciate what they do when they're preaching the gospel. You let them get in their home congregation and preach until it's 15 minutes past the hour. what happens? What happens and why? When,
People that listen to those men were better listeners than we are today.
why? You're right. You're exactly right. 100% right. Why?
They knew the scriptures and they
Because they were Bible students who cared about the truth more than they cared about many other things. I'm not saying that we don't have Bible students today. Please don't take this as an attack. It's not an attack. But let's think about why it is the way it is. Why, when we start a worship service and it gets close to that hour point, why there's more attention on this than on this. Because the fact is, if we get out 5 or 10 minutes past the hour, there are people who come out of this assembly who come out and make a point. They're never ugly. Never ugly. I would not accuse any of the brethren here of ever being ugly about it. Nobody ever has been, to me. But they'll make a point. And the point they'll make is, we should have been done 5 or 10 minutes ago. Not ugly, but they get their point across. And do you know what it makes the preacher realize? It does not really matter what I'm preaching. It doesn't matter what truth is being brought out. It doesn't matter how helpful and how beneficial and positive this could be in someone's life. What matters is that we get out the door by the time the hour hits. So do you know what that does to our preachers? It discourages. And they can get up there and be in the middle of a sermon and really be getting into, at least for the preacher, really into something great. And they glance down and notice their watch. And you know what they do? Pull it back. I got to cut this point off. We got to wrap up and get out of here. Because we can't take an extra 5 or 10 minutes of Bible. Because we've got lunch plans. We've got lunch plans. Plans with a family member. We made plans this afternoon with a friend. And you're eating into my plan time to the point that it bothers me. Because I'm going to be late now. It bothers me because there's something else I need to be doing. And what I'm admitting is that the worship that I am offering unto God does not mean to me as much as something else. I allotted my time for this hour. And when this hour's up, I'm done. God doesn't get any more. Now, that may not hit any of you exactly that way. There are times when it hits me that way, being the one who gets the point made at the back door too. You hear that a time or two, and sometimes it's frustrating. Yes?
Sometimes the best way to avoid sin is prevention.
Yes.
How about Bible class at 9:30, worship at 10:30?
Why not?
That way I'm not hungry if it goes an hour and a half.
There you go. And you know what? And in all seriousness, listen, there are people who are diabetic, who if they sit through an hour Bible class and an hour of worship, by the end of that time, they're struggling. That's not what I'm talking about. Believe you me. And I would never be offended if we were right in the middle of worship and somebody had to get out their peanut butter and crackers and eat something to handle no problem. Or get up and walk out the door and go take care of what you need to. Fine. No problem there. I'm not talking about a person who's got a difficulty like that.
No, but I'm being
But
serious.
that's
That's not a bad
That's not a bad idea.
If it goes an
Yeah.
hour and 10 or hour and 15,
Yes.
you're still out before you want to.
Yes.
You, whatever plan, because people do make plans
Yes.
assuming certain things.
That's exactly right.
And,
That's right.
or we could just say, hey, as a courtesy, let's plan on 12, we'll be done by 12:30. And
Sure.
some days it'll be 12, some days it'll be 12:15.
Yeah.
And it's never the song leader's fault that he led all 5 verses of all 5 songs.
Oh, no, no, no.
He gets
No.
up and says a 5-minute prayer.
No, it's preacher's fault. Yeah. That's just the way it is. It just goes on. And you know what? Listen, we're at a point studying about something here where I'm expressing some of my thoughts and feelings. I'm not flawless either. There are times when I have struggles and difficulties, and sometimes this is one of them. And it may have nothing whatsoever to do with somebody lacking spirituality. I'm telling you, sometimes that's how it hits me because I have frailties. I have difficulties just like anybody. And so when somebody comes out and makes that point, sometimes it hits me a different way. Yes, sir.
The old covenant, touching on what Keith was talking about, keeping the Sabbath day holy meant more than just, worshiping on the Sabbath day.
Yes.
One of the reasons they couldn't travel so far is you took care of a lot of that nonsense that would have eaten up your spirituality on the Sabbath, right?
That's right.
Get your kids fed and all that stuff.
That's right.
You have stuff cooked and you close enough to simply, in other words, prior mental preparation is better than physical preparation of salt and water.
That's right. That's exactly right. That could be very helpful too, to keep that in mind. Our preparations leading up to the first day of the week oftentimes play just as important a role as our going and doing on the first day of the week. We need to be prepared for it. Joe?
Well, we often talk about how we try to separate ourselves from the denominational world. That's a practice that we seem to have adopted from them, which is found right beside the sinner's prayer, I think, when I was
Yeah. Well, yeah, but that is kind of what we understand. Should we understand it that way? Should we take it differently and look at it from a different perspective? Yes, sir.
I've probably sat through more worship than anybody here, in the church. And I don't know why I don't get that away with anything else, but it just goes off at 12 noon.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Well,
The first place I ever went probably was
Yeah.
church.
yes, sir.
And it's not gonna be the last place, because they ain't gonna be when I'm here.
And I've seen and probably have reposted some bulletin articles and things people have written about the difference in attitude when we go to a ball game versus coming and gathering in worship. There's some truth in that we need to consider and look deeply at ourselves. Because if I'm doing something I really enjoy and appreciate and am involved and invested in, it doesn't bother me when it goes into overtime. It doesn't bother me if it lasts a little bit longer. But if something is a drudgery, if something is a duty, when it goes into overtime, I don't like it. And that's why sometimes it hits me differently, because maybe you're not thinking the same way I am when I hear the point being made. If somebody had something scheduled and assumed we're going to be out at 12, I get it. There are times when I intend to do something that somebody else's schedule runs me late, and I don't like it. I understand that. That really doesn't affect me. It would be the attitude behind it, because sometimes a point is made, and again, nobody here has ever been ugly. I've been some places where if it was 5 or 10 minutes after, people were very pointed, could almost just be flat out ugly about it. And, it baffles me. And it sometimes causes me difficulty in the way I'm dealing with and viewing brethren. And so I try to work on that, and I try to keep that in consideration, but sometimes it's a problem for me. Yes, sir.
Well, doesn't this all boil down to, where's your priorities lie? This is not a
Sure.
job. This is the ultimate goal of where we're trying to get to.
Yes.
Time.
Yep.
There's no
was actually starting this, I went further with this than what I actually intended to. The reason I started into this was to say, one of the reasons, I think, why people get to that point where they turn it off and they're ready to go is attention span. A person who doesn't have great familiarity with the truth, who doesn't know what the Bible teaches, if we sit down and do a 3-hour Bible study, it's going way over their, not over their intelligence, but beyond their capacity to hold it in, to gather it and benefit from it. And we have to be cognizant of that on Sundays as well. Because if you get up and...
They can digest in one sitting.
Yes, that's it.
More than they can digest. You
That's
give
it.
them so much,
Yes.
they can't digest all of it.
There have been jokes for years about the preachers getting up and preaching a 3-point sermon. You know why that is. Because if it's a 15-point sermon, it's going to take an hour to preach it, and 12 of those points are going to be forgotten by the time they walk out the door.
I think the average human brain just can't ingest that much. I mean, if you, for people that watch movies, if you were to go to that person after they walked out of a 2-hour movie, what happens in the first 15 minutes? They can't tell you.
That depends.
Exciting in the first 15 minutes.
That depends. I've watched people go to a 4-hour ball game who can tell you pretty much play by play what happened through the entire game. And I've seen people go and heard of people going and sitting through a 2.5-hour sermon and doing the same thing. It's a matter of conditioning. We've been conditioned by our society, conditioned by the television, conditioned by so many things to where we've got about a 15 or 20 minute attention span. And once that attention span gets blown, short of the preacher backing down and putting PowerPoint up with a commercial to get that next 30 seconds out and then get back into it, you know, if we do that, we could probably preach and do stuff all afternoon. If about every 15 minutes there'd be a commercial break. So people could kind of clear their mind and let all that go for a minute and then back into it.
But then what we should remember more, the start of the commercial.
There you go. Might not grow spiritually, but we'd go buy something. I'm using, hopefully you get lighthearted things too here, but there's some seriousness to
But
it.
it goes back to your point about Randall and
Yes.
Larry as well.
That's right.
That if everything you tell me is new information,
Yes.
I don't have a scaffolding to put that stuff on. It's
No.
just, by 15 minutes, I'm gone.
Yes.
But if I understand a lot of what you're saying,
That's
and then
it.
you give me a new kernel, my brain isn't flooded. That's easily fileable in the
That's it.
memory.
Yes.
So sometimes the inundation doesn't happen if you're already well versed.
There you go. And in the discussion that they have that night, Mike actually brings out later that Larry brought up a passage that he had never considered before in part of the discussion. Now, if he did that all night long, that would be detrimental. That would be a problem. Again, nothing to hang all that on, but because he was already so familiar with all of these scriptures and all of these types of arguments, then when he brought up one passage that he'd never considered before, he's already got a basis here to build on. He can handle that. He can deal with that. And they have some great discussion. I don't want to, again, we could sit here and do this all night. We're going to move on a little bit further. Another character comes in the next chapter. And I don't know how far we'll get with this. Jason may be able to pick this up on Sunday morning and continue this. But he talks to a fella that he plays racquetball with. Now, Larry's one friend that he does a lot of things with. Now he mentions a man named Ryan, who is someone who works with the government, at least the state government. He works at Capitol Hill, and he's around that area. He calls him a lobbyist. And they play racquetball together, and so they get done playing racquetball. They're getting ready, I guess, to go to work or home. I don't remember where they were heading after that, but they are done. They're getting dressed and about to leave, and he asks him, "What do you think, or what do you know about?" And he puts it in parentheses there every time he mentions it. That's not an accident, by the way. If you hand this book to somebody who is not a member of the church and doesn't know all of these things, when he wrote this book, he explained that he did not want people to read the name of the church, Church of Christ, right up in all through this story, and turn it off. So he chose to not list the name of it and just put in parentheses Randall's Church. And of course he's talking about the Church of Christ. So he asked him, what do you know about the Church of Christ? And he says his friend has great recall. He starts talking about his great uncle, who had some kind of association with a man who was a member of the Church of Christ. And this man was a notable man. There's an insurance building, a life and casualty insurance business, that he had built that building and started that business way back in the early 1900s. And this man, he said, was a very benevolent man, a very giving individual. And he said Lipscomb University is what it is today because of this man's financial giving. He helped them out that much. He ends up saying that he's known throughout this whole area and that he is one of the finest Christian people you would ever meet in this area. And that he is very very giving, very benevolent toward orphanages and colleges, and just a helpful man, a good man. Isn't it wonderful for somebody to talk about someone in this way and say, that person's a member of the church? Not only that person, but then he goes on to say to Mike, if you're thinking about becoming a member of this church, you won't regret it. Because they have a good reputation all around here, all around the capital. How does a congregation of the church carry that kind of influence? How's that possible? So how's that possible? How do the members make that congregation that notable in a community? Through what they do, through what they say, their influence, their attitude, not just general speaking, but in the very literal words they use and all the things that they do every day. Mike talks about himself a little bit later on, talking about him and Larry and getting together and talking on a further occasion, but he says all this Bible study, all this daily Bible reading is having an effect on him. He goes to a party, he doesn't drink like he used to. He talks about Larry as keeping himself clean from alcohol and even coffee and all kinds of things. He's starting to acknowledge that I see a difference in people when they are Bible reading, Bible studying, Bible practicing, following people. I see a difference in them. And by reading and studying my Bible so much, it's making a change in me. I'm not the same person I was a few months ago. I'm doing things differently, and he recognizes it's the Bible that's causing this. So we could ask the question the way I did a minute ago, how can the church have such an influence in the community? Let's turn it around and ask it in a different way. How could the church not have this kind of influence in their community? What in the world would keep the Lord's church, no matter where it is, having this kind of reputation?
I'll give you an example. I'm not preaching in Prattville, Alabama. This lady was a faithful member. Her husband attended with her. Finally, he obeyed the gospel. He told me, he said, I want to say something. He said to the congregation, he said, I've been attending here a long time. I've been hearing the gospel preached. I've been seeing the way some of you people who work with me live. And that's why I've waited so long to obey the gospel, because I didn't see that.
That's
So I think that gets some attention.
That's pretty strong to have to say. You know, that's the truth, though. That's exactly what Jesus told his disciples. That's what he has given to us in the Word. The way we live, the way we speak, what our lives are showing and reflecting out here in the world is going to either have a positive or negative influence. No Christian ever needs to be so deceived as to think that their example, their influence is benign. It just doesn't affect people. Because the fact is, our influence affects everybody that sees us. Everybody that knows us. How well they know us, how much they see of us, also affects how much influence we have on them. But we have influence on everybody with whom we have contact, for either good or ill. What happens if 10 years after you met somebody, they find out you go to church somewhere? 10 years. And, well, I didn't realize you went to church. What does that say? What does that say to that person? And what's the immediate impact of that from the last 10 years?
You don't live like it.
You may not live a horribly evil life, but you're also obviously not living in such a way as to illustrate Christ to them. You're not talking to them about the gospel. You might be living what we would think of as a benign life, just kind of straight, going through, not doing great good or great evil. But the fact is, if it's not doing good, it is evil. It is wrong. It's sinful. If our good is not easily seen, then we're creating problems. It's one thing to go out and toot your horn, to try to draw attention to yourself. That's not what we're talking about. There's a difference in a person trying to get the name and getting the praise personally. There's another issue, though, that needs to be understood. While I may not want to get that praise personally, I don't want God to miss that praise. I don't want God to miss that glory. So if I do my good works and I make sure they're completely hidden so nobody will ever know, because I don't want that kind of praise, that may be born out of a good heart, a good attitude. But the reality is, people need to see the good that's being done. But what they need to see in us is when the time comes, and it will happen, that somebody tries to bring the praise to us, that we point them to God. And we don't receive that kind of praise or acknowledgement. We make sure that God gets it.
This wealthy, benevolent gentleman that the man recommends, Brother A.M. Burke.
Yes.
I never met him, but I got a Christmas card from him every year as long as you live.
Is that right?
I think he sent one to every gospel preacher in the world.
That's fantastic. What's he doing? He's exerting an influence. And he was making sure, look at all the great things that was said about him. But even as these things are being said about him, I have no doubt, knowing what all he did, he probably had a really good attitude about it, or else people would not have been referring to him as the finest Christian man in the whole area. Because if people see that you're out for the praise of men, they don't consider that to be great Christianity. They consider it to be hypocritical. And they'll very quickly and easily see why you're doing it when they see who you're pointing to. It's either look at me or it's look at God. The only reason I'm doing these things is because of God. The only reason I have the capacity, the capability, and the desire is because of God. And so we point it to God. We don't need to do everything behind closed doors to such a point that nobody can see the good works of the church. They need to see that. What they don't need to see is any individual standing out front saying, look at me. That's not what this is about. But he talks about all the good things that he was doing. And then he talks about the influence of this church throughout this whole capital community. He said they have a great reputation all around here. All around the capital. A great reputation. There's only one way for the church to have a great reputation. And that's for the church to be doing what Christ told the church to do, and for the church to be making sure that Christ gets the glory for it. That's the only way that the church gets a good reputation. To do the good things, not just refrain from evil. That's an essential part of it as well. If you're living worldly lives, it will nullify any good aspect of doing the good works. So if you're keeping clean from worldliness and doing the good works of Christ and making sure that he gets the glory, then the church is going to have a good reputation. I think sometimes the reason the church doesn't have the reputation is too many people are hiding what they're doing. Because I know brethren are doing a lot of good things. A lot of good things. And it's probably many times out of this this sense of, I don't want to be glorified. I don't want to be held up. So what I do, I'll do privately. I'll do quietly. I'll do secretly. That way I never get held up. Well, we can make sure that if people know about the good we're doing and they start trying to hold us up, we can make sure they don't hold us up in a wrong way. But you also can't be a good influence and a good example for people unless they see what you're doing. That's how the influence takes place. They see what you're doing. They hear what you're saying. And an influence is exerted. If every good thing is done in secret, then no good influence is taking place. We need to know that we're influencing people, and sometimes by hiding the good things we do, perhaps even out of a good way of not wanting to be praised personally, we're robbing our influence from those people's lives. And what they're left with is a 10-year relationship where they're saying, I don't ever see you do anything in the name of Christ. I don't see you do things in the community, do things that are helpful and that are good. People need to see that. But they need to know not that it's coming from an individual. They need to know it's coming from the church. They need to know it's coming from Christ. They need to know there's a source behind all of this and one to whom all the glory must go. They need to see that. Brother Burton did a lot of good, and people looked up to him for it. As long as he kept them from looking up to him in a wrong way, that's all right. Because he, and through him, the church, and through the church, Christ, was being given a good name throughout this capital city. We need to see that. We need to understand that. The people of our community need to see the good that we do. Not so we get praised. Not so there'll be a newspaper write-up about these folks over here in West Georgia and praise us for what we're doing. But so God will be glorified. How is God going to be glorified by people of the world? Only if somebody is showing them, leading them to the ways of truth. And that, after all, is the whole goal and purpose of the church in this world. To bring others to the truth. To evangelize this world. Do you know why there are some groups in this world who have been so successful at evangelism even though they don't teach people the truth of the Bible? Because they do good things. They do good. People see the good they do and they flock to them, oftentimes because of the good they do. And then they may not even hear the truth from them. But they're doing good. So then the accusation comes, well, you say you have the truth, but you're sitting there doing nothing with it. We need to be thoughtful about this. This congregation, the church in this area, in the Nashville area, the church is very large, has been for a long time. So it might not be just one congregation. It might be a number of congregations in that area that are putting out this good name and this good influence. And it's having a good effect. Here's a man who's not a member of the church who doesn't have anything but high praise to say about this man who has lived and gone, about the church in the whole area, and telling this man, if you want to be a member of that church, you won't regret it. That's a far cry from somebody saying, if you go join them, they're a bunch of cultists. They'll brainwash you. You won't know what you're doing. Well, they have a good name because they have a good influence. They're letting people see what good they're doing. It's having a great effect on those around them. Thank you so much for all your discussion and all your thoughtful